Sometimes you hear about people who, don't want to go to the doctor because they're afraid what doctor might find, right? It sounds crazy when you think like you're sick, you should definitely go to the doctor, but hey, you might be even sicker, you might not even know, right? So I think the same idea can happen with companies where they think, like we're doing well, but if we start diving into the numbers, we may really discover that we're not doing that well, that there's serious holes.
Welcome to the B2B Digital Marketer Podcast, a podcast helping you to end your struggle with digital marketing, helping you to pave a new and better path to target and capture your ideal customer. Each week, we teach you how insiders and experts debunk the dreary and become engines of innovation. Now, here's your host, Jim Rembach.
Okay, B2B DM gang, I'm excited to have the guest that we have on today, Ruben Ugarte, because we're going to talk about something that I've been exposed to for about 20 years, and that is working with customer experience data. But that's not the part that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about taking data, driving insights, and making better decisions. And for even organizations that think they're doing a good job of using data in order to do that, they may not be, and Ruben's going to share that with us. Also, if you're trying to sell to other companies, you need to understand a little bit more about what they are doing or not with their data. Ruben, thanks for joining us today.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks, Jim.
Now, before we get into learning a little bit more about you and your background, if you could share with us, what do B2B digital marketers need to be thinking right now?
Wow. The pandemic has, of course, been talked about ad nauseum for a year now. But nonetheless, as we get into this recovery, there's a few things that marketers should be thinking about. One is personalization, right? This idea that being able to communicate with customers directly, to do in a way that makes sense to them, I think will become an even bigger issue. And we can dive into examples of companies that do this well versus not. I do think data in general will become more important. We're seeing, for example, retailers, as they make a switch to a more direct-to-consumer model, and what big role data might play there. So if you're working with those type of companies, you're in that space, now is really the time to really get a handle on your data. And then lastly, I think it's also about understanding the limitations of data. We saw a lot of companies in the pandemic that were unable to make decisions. There was so much uncertainty, so much lack of data, so much lack of understanding, and they got stuck and frozen. And that became a huge deal, right? Because they had to move, they had to make choices. And I think the same thing will apply now as we go into recovery. There'll still be uncertainty. So those are things that I think marketers need to be thinking about as to how they approach their work, their companies, or even their clients.
Thanks for sharing that. And we're going to get into many of those key points here in a second. But before we do that, tell us a little bit about you, your background, and how you're going to add value to this conversation we're going to have today.
Yeah, so my background is as an engineer, and that actually really helps with data. I find data, as any marketer can attest, is very technical. There's a lot of details to it. There's bugs, there's errors, and you have to typically deal with some kind of engineering person, some kind of technical person to get it going. So my background has allowed me to work primarily with marketers. I'll say, it's mostly marketing teams that bring me on at their companies, and then help bridge some of the gaps they may be having with their engineering team, some of the pushback they may be getting. And I help companies really get the most out of data. I work with very small companies, 5, 10-person companies, even smaller startups, all the way down to public companies. And the problems are surprisingly quite similar. They differ a little bit, of course, based on stage, but there's a lot of similarities. And it's really all about how to get more insights out of whatever data you have. Doesn't matter if you have a lot or a little, and how to change behavior and how to make better decisions.
Well, you had also talked about the shift of what had occurred in a lot of organizations found themselves with the COVID not having either certain pieces of data or not clean data in order to be able to make a decision and move forward. But I would dare to say, did that vulnerability take place? Because for the most part, when you look at year over year, things were somewhat consistent. So therefore, I didn't have a worry.
Yeah, I would say so. I think a lot of companies found themselves in no man's land. They had never seen numbers like this. I work with tourism agencies here in Canada, and they all kept telling me we'd never seen drops in visitor numbers like this ever. So they're faced with effectively crazy numbers, and how do you deal with? How do you market? Where do you market? Who do you market to? What do you say? Those were all questions that all the many companies and teams, even companies that I think were doing really well, industries that did well, I think they were still faced with the same question of what do we actually do? And I think that's some of the things I cover in the book, that you need to be able to make decisions without data, because one day you won't have them. So if you're stuck, if you're paralyzed without it, then you're really going to have issues with uncertainty. And uncertainty, I think, is the name of the game now in our world.
So when you say decisions using data, for me, I think for a lot of organizations, they end up using it more as a backup than they do as a driver in their decision-making process. And what I mean by that is, if I was to say, well, when am I going to look at the information in order to be able to decide, it comes later in that process versus the beginning. Now, for me, you're more skilled at this. Where should the data come when I'm actually formulating my decisions?
Yeah, so I think it should actually come at the very beginning when you're trying to decide what to do or where to go. And let me give you a marketing example. I work with a company that they were really good at driving leads, but the quality of those leads wasn't as high. So the sales team was struggling to convert them. So a very classic problem. But the marketing team didn't actually quite know how to change this. For years, their focus had been, let's drive more and more leads. And as long as they hit their quota, they were fine. And the sales team, that's their problem. They're not able to close them. So to kind of figure out where to go from there, as a sort of major shift in strategy for the marketing team, they were able to go into the data. And I want to make it clear that this is not, this massive data science machine learning project where they spend 6 months in a chamber going through all the numbers. They just started to segment their audience and say, okay, here's, we have 1,000 leads. What are the different segments we have here? What segments tend to convert higher than other segments? And in this case, they were dealing with students. So they had different types of students, whether community college students or Ivy League students. And then from there, start to figure out what are the different demographics, what do they care about, who should we focus, what should the marketing say towards those people, where do we find them? So that's, to me, the role that data plays. It's not very complex, but it starts to give you hints as to here's where we should go, here's what we need to learn next, and here's where we can start shifting our marketing campaigns, our emails, and so on.
So for me, as you're talking about that, I start thinking about, if I'm a B2B organization, there's been a lot of talk around this account-based marketing type of strategy. And so for me, that's whole segmentation, account-based marketing, all of that is data-driven, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. That's the same idea, whether we're talking about students, which are consumers, of course. The same idea applies even more to companies, right? Because who do you go after? Do you go after every single company? What's the characteristics? What's going to make them likely to buy? What's going to make them likely to use the product and be retained? I think those are all questions about data, and data in the right amounts can start to give you insights into what those answers actually look like.
Okay, so this starts getting into a whole strategy issue. And when you look at a lot of the research on organizations of all kinds of different sizes, one of the areas where they struggle the most is on the entire strategy piece. So in marketing, we're talking about creating strategies that do not get into that level of just say precision, to be able to really target. Because ideally, if we were to say I have 10 different customer types or customer segment groups, it's a lot of work and effort to make sure that I have the relevancy and the personalization to be able to make sure that I'm building trust within them, and they're saying, oh, I'm a good provider. They're talking to me. And then therefore I take that next step. I mean, it's a lot of work. So could I potentially not be using the data because I know it's going to mean more work on the back end?
I think so. Yeah. Sometimes you hear about people who, don't want to go to the doctor because they're afraid what doctor might find, right? It sounds crazy when you think that you're sick, you should definitely go to a doctor, but hey, you might be even sicker, you might not even know, right? So I think the same idea can happen with companies where they think, like we're doing well, but if we start diving into the numbers, we may really discover that we're not doing that well, that there's serious holes. But this is crazy when you talk about it, right? So you have to do it. And I actually think companies are spending a lot of time, small, large, doesn't matter, simply doing things, right? So they're already busy building campaigns and running A/B tests and writing copy and all these things. But they're not quite sure if this is where they should be spending their efforts, right? They're missing the strategy because they may be targeting the completely wrong customers. And I'm sure we come across examples, your audience and yourself, where this was the wrong segment altogether. They're never going to buy. It's almost but it's a significant portion of your time. So I think that's the mindset that companies should be approaching data, not as in who knows what we'll find, but we can really start to shift our time and spend as much time as possible working on the right things and reduce the amount of time that is wasted.
Yeah, it's counterintuitive. I mean, we essentially, shut that door, but sooner or later that thing's going to bust through and it's going to be quite nasty, right? Okay, so the first chapter in the book, you kind of set, a very compelling question that I think I would like to dive into here. And the title is The Reality of Being Data-Driven and Why Your Company Isn't. You got to tell us what you're talking about.
Well, data-driven has been the driving force, a mantra for maybe 20 years now. And I think it's a little misguided. I think it's forced companies to think that, you're going to make every single decision with data. It's all going to start with data. If you don't have data, you don't move. If you have an opinion that's not backed by data, do not even bring that into the boardroom. And I think it's the wrong approach. Companies, and I talk about later on in the book, should really think of establishing a data supported culture where data supports you in your decisions along the way, gives you insights, gives you guidance, helps you go back in the right track, but it's not the end all be all, right? And it's not, you don't have to completely rearrange your company around data and put data at the heart of it. Some companies do. We can talk about that. But really, it's just about, are you learning things that change your behavior, right? Are you doing new things? That's really what it comes down to at the end of the day with data. Do you learn something that you can then take and change a campaign or change the messaging? And if you're doing that, then you're being data supported and you're doing well. But you don't have to be driven by data. You don't have to let data sort of take the lead in everything.
I think that's a very, very important distinction. And I even find it with, individual, entrepreneurs that may be just running their own business. You can call them solopreneurs if you want, is they may be doing a lot of activities, but don't have visibility into the impact and performance of it. And, it's not supporting them. And oftentimes they just omit it and they just go off of habit in regards to, hey, well, this is what everybody else is doing. I need to do this as well. And they kind of fall into, what you can call as far as the sea of sameness, right? I'm doing everything just like everybody else. So I would dare to say if somebody needed to really, change the way that they, approached the things that they're doing from a tactical perspective and make sure that they do have the data in there, what would you recommend to them?
Yeah. So, I would start, and I think this applies to an individual person, a small team, or perhaps even a team within a larger company, is to start with a handful of KPIs that matter to you, right? Now, because of the way data is collected, you have this ability to track an unlimited number of KPIs. Anyone who opened Google Analytics ever knows what I'm talking about. So there's an unlimited number of KPIs, but only a handful really makes sense. So for an individual person, a coach, an entrepreneur, it might be simple things like sales, maybe some of the number of calls you're making to clients or prospects, your conversion rate, things like that. And that's where you start your tracking. It could be simple, right? It could be just a spreadsheet. It could be a dashboard. And then you build from there. And if you're missing data to calculate some of those KPIs, that's where you then start to determine, okay, here's what I'm missing. Maybe I need a tool here. Maybe I need an upgrade to whatever technology I have. But you go from there instead of starting on the other side, which is what could I collect? What could I track? Which is endless. And it's just going to drown you in data. And I think that's what a lot of companies do. They start with what they can track, collect, and then they'll say, and then we'll figure out after. We'll figure out how to use it after. But the usage is quite tricky.
Oftentimes when you start talking about data, I hear different things that for me, I start wondering, are they the same? Or is there, different mindsets or philosophies behind it? And then what I mean by that is people will say, well, we're data driven. And then other people will say, well, that we're numbers driven. To me, I don't think they're necessarily the same thing. What have you found?
Oh, that's a good point. I see the distinction, and I would say I hear a lot about numbers driven from the financial side of the company, whoever manages the finances, and they'll say, here are numbers, here's a profit, a P&L, here's how we manage the company. I've seen that. And then, of course, maybe marketing teams might talk more about being data driven. What's the data saying? The distinction to me would come from, I think if we look at financial numbers, they are straight up numbers. Here's your revenue, your margin, your costs, and you're sort of driving the company and making decisions based on that. That works, of course. It's one approach. And I think where companies or teams or people say we're data driven, they are talking much more than just numbers. Yeah, you have numbers like landing page conversions and clicks on ads and things like that. Those might be your quantitative, but then you also have qualitative NPS or what customers are saying on surveys or some other kind of qualitative measure. So you're being driven or you're being guided or supported by this combination of quantitative and qualitative versus just the pure numbers.
Okay, so as you're saying that, I'm starting to visualize certain pictures in my head of, certain numbers and data that have traditionally been used in certain parts of the organization that don't necessarily go to others. So I've spent a lot of my years working in contact centers and customer service, and been using that from both an inbound sales perspective as well as customer, retention and servicing perspective. But I think with the shifts that have occurred over the past couple of years, have you seen certain parts of the organization using data that they traditionally haven't used, and now they're finding value from it?
Yeah. Now you see much more enrichment, for example, being able to bring external data in. So for a long time, it was all about your data, your customer data, emails, names, phone numbers. Now you see much more enrichment of that data to bring demographics, gender, if you don't have it, lifestyle numbers. And again, you start to really flesh out a much more holistic, more human picture of actually who your customers are. It's not just a data point, a bunch of people who paid you money, but here's what they care about. Here's how they use our product in their everyday lives. I also think you're seeing much more qualitative. Quantitative has been sort of the major thing companies want, right? Financial, as we mentioned before, they look at the numbers, right? And if it's not profitable, it's not profitable. But it also misses a few things. Some of the customer support, some of the customer happiness or customer satisfaction is not always fully captured by a number or a metric. So now you hear companies talk more about what are customers thinking, what do they like, what do they don't like, how can we improve, how can we use that in our marketing and so on. So those are two areas where I see some new data coming in, and I think it's just easier to track now, to run some of those surveys automatically, to talk to customers at scale without having this massive effort.
Well, I think what you said right there is the key thing. I mean, one of the reasons that I found that qualitative analysis was, never really considered is because of the whole effort associated with doing qualitative data. I mean, it's a whole, when you start talking about coding, when you start talking about cleansing, when you start talking about all of the things that you need to do in order to make the qualitative data, an effective data set, it takes a lot of effort. But like you said, it is also true with speech analytics technologies, with a lot of the ability to convert, voice to text, and that's getting better. Some of those, models in regards to cost versus value have changed quite a bit.
Yeah.
So how much has AI and artificial intelligence started playing in all of this?
Yeah, AI is already here, right? It's we have all likely experienced it in some shape or form. I would say it's primarily used by larger organizations. I do think an individual in a small company should be generally aware of what's possible and what's hype and what's not. It doesn't mean it might be applicable either to yourself or to your clients, but at least you know what the landscape is. So really AI, yeah.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, there's a handful of use cases where AI is really useful. For example, anything to do with pattern recognition. So we see it when Facebook recognizes faces in photos, or Google Photos does the same thing. Fraud, a lot of payment processors, companies like Stripe, PayPal, and some of the biggest ones, they now use AI to detect fraud before it happens. So they minimize some of the costs, some of those chargebacks you might see. And in some cases, we see AI in a sort of very high innovation fields. Self-driving cars might be the best example, right? Of AI that's trying to be used here. However, it's very experimental. Self-driving cars have been around for 70 years now, right? The research on it, and we still don't have it. And it might be here in the next 10 years. It might not be. It's unclear. It's a really hard problem to tackle. But those are the use cases that started to become relevant and helpful for companies if they have the scale and they have the data to take advantage of them.
And on the marketing side, I mean, we've covered this with quite a few guests on our show in regards to how artificial intelligence is being used in content creation. We've talked about how artificial intelligence is being used in strategy development. And those actually can be done at an individual level. So we do have some of these SaaS-based solutions and tools that are out there that will allow organizations to create better content that's already going to be SEO optimized. And we talked about that on a previous episode. We talked about how to create a strategy based off of who my targets are and things like that. So it's definitely becoming a scenario where organizations of all sizes can start leveraging it more and more. So I'd be interested to see from a data perspective how we can see some of that also taking into effect when we start looking at, for example, modeling, right? We start doing some sophisticated data modeling and we start throwing in some AI insights into it, and it could cause us to potentially take a direction that we've never even considered before. Is that true?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, I think a lot of those cases fall into sort of like basic pattern recognition. And I'll give you an example that I think a lot of marketing teams are starting to see on a regular basis, which is attribution models, whether it's last click or first click and so on. But designing attribution models based on data, and Google Analytics, for example, maybe the most popular sort of attribution tool out there for a lot of companies, they have now released, I believe they call it algorithm attribution. It's effectively AI attribution. So they provide an AI model and they let you attribute your conversions based on machine learning or AI. And it's meant to have or to give you a much more balanced way of looking at conversions and the multiple touches that might be required to get to a conversion. So I would see examples like that. And that helps companies manage their spending, right? Be able to decrease their spending by being more efficient. Of course, any company that runs Facebook ads, Google ads, you're being helped by AI. Those, the attribution models that Facebook uses to optimize your ads are now fundamentally run by AI, and the reason now is you basically just tell Facebook, here's my conversion, here's my ad, you do the heavy lifting. It's because those AI models are much better than what we might be able to do with targeting. So those are examples, but like I said, I think in a lot of those examples, the AI is hidden. You don't see it. You're not writing the code yourself. You're taking advantage of a software tool or something that was already built, and it's great because you don't have to go hire, a very expensive data scientist. You can take advantage of someone else who already did this.
Talking about that data scientist, I mean, so there's a lot of people who. Well, let me tell this story. I think this is going to be important to kind of set the stage of where I'm going with this and trying to get your insights on it. I'm actually a certified pitching coach. Some who have listened to the show on a regular basis may have heard me talk about that. And for me, when I don't have to work anymore and I can retire, I want to be a college pitching coach. That's what I want to do. A lot of those programs.
Sorry, is this a baseball pitching coach?
That's correct. Baseball pitching coach. That's right.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the smaller schools, Division III and two as well, they only have 2 paid coaching positions. They rely on unpaid coaches in order to help to run the program. So for me, I'm like, hey, I have learned all these things, and I'd love to come help you. And oh, by the way, you don't have to pay me. Win-win, right? So anyway,
yeah.
So anyway, I was attending this particular clinic with a bunch of different college coaches and performance coaches. It was just on pitching. That's what I want to specialize on. And I was talking to this pitching coach who is a coach at the University of Missouri, Fred Corral. Just a dynamic guy, very, very knowledgeable. And we were talking about analytics, baseball analytics, and using analytics in order to be able to make better decisions, right? It's data, right? It's the same thing as a business, same thing in sports. They're doing it all the time now. And we were talking about interpreting of that data. And he was saying how a lot of college students come out of these sports analytics programs, and they start doing all this, data analysis, and then they say, look what I found. And he said, but the problem is they don't have the practical understanding and application of what it takes in order to be able to play the game, in order to be able to coach the game, in order to be able to develop players. And he said something along the lines of, you just can't teach new dogs old tricks.
Yeah.
And so I think that's really important when we start thinking about interpreting data, right? We can do all this analysis, and I mean, we can make it, throw AI in it, do all this other stuff. But unless we have that understanding of the business and the business acumen, I mean, aren't we greatly and potentially hampered when we start looking at interpretation?
Yeah. And, I think you brought up a couple of examples where there has been perhaps too much focus brought to the altar of analytics. Of course, Moneyball swept through the baseball world maybe about 10 years ago. And I imagine every baseball team out there now has some kind of data science team that helps them choose recruits and strategy. I don't doubt that. I actually follow a lot of NBA. I don't follow baseball. And in the basketball, the Houston Rockets are known as the analytics team. They were driven completely by analytics. Their data determined that they should shoot more 3-pointers. So they started shooting more 3-pointers than anyone else in the league. And they're a good team, right? They make the playoffs. They're consistently a team in contention, but they actually haven't won a championship in, 20 years. So data can get you there and can help you choose those recruits and maybe tweak your strategy. But there's definitely a human element. We might call it instinct or gut or whatever else, maybe just experience, that is really what really gets you over the hump. And sometimes companies, I think, and even of course teams, may get stuck with, what does the data tell you? And if the data doesn't tell us that, we're not going to do it. But then you completely disregard, people like the example you mentioned, right? People like Fred, who have all this experience, and he may say, I see this, the data doesn't support me, but I see this from all my years of experience. So finding the balance between those two worlds, I think, is what the best companies do well. They don't treat data like a hammer, in search of nails.
Well, So I think there's a piece in there that I think is even a more important message there. And you really started talking about the whole discounting of, right? Then the other piece, another side of that could be bias associated with it. So in other words, if it doesn't support my hypothesis, I will discount it easily.
Yeah.
So how do you find that balance of not, inducing or allowing bias, to cause you to really, take advantage of what's sitting there right in front of you?
Yeah. I mean, what I've seen companies do really well to deal with that bias is, on your own, there's only so much you can do. There's a reason this where bias can get sticky. So what I see companies do is get them to defend different roles. So you might have a marketing team that has the data in front of them, and they say, the data is telling us to lean towards more paid advertising. Does anyone, can anyone take a position to defend why we should spend more money on organic search, or why should spend more money on referrals? Let's kind of go through this debate and see where we end up with. And I find that's a great way to deal with bias. Companies just have to find the time, which can be hard, and be able to go through this kind of process. And sometimes it's just about, hey, just play devil's advocate, take the other position, tell me why this won't work, and all the reasons we may fail. And what this also does, and it can help you surface things that you might that may actually derail us. So you may discover that, hey, here's 3 or 4 issues that if we don't tackle them, if we don't prevent them, they could really affect our strategy. Let's deal with them. So that's one way to start dealing with bias. You become aware of it, but then you need to, I think, take advantage of group dynamics to deal with it. And I think going back to Moneyball, right? I remember that baseball teams, the way they recruit is they would get the recruiters around the table and they would debate the players and say, this player is good, this player is not good, I don't like his hit, he walks funny, or whatever it may be. So this kind of process can be effective with teams as they debate numbers and they don't treat them as a holy grail. Like, here are the numbers, no one can debate them.
So you also talk a lot about, experimenting and making better decisions. Yeah. Talk a little bit about what you mean by that.
Well, experimentation culture, I think, is at the heart of a lot of what really great companies do well. They have big hits, they have big home runs, but they're also making a lot of first base hits, second base hits, a lot of walks. And a lot of times when I've been with teams and we've been stuck in a debate, should we do this, should we not do this? What I tell them is, hey, you know what? In a few weeks, we could find out, right? We could actually run the test, do it in a way that's not intrusive to customers. You don't have to show it to all your customers, your entire website traffic. And you can start to get a little more insights. So what we need now is just to figure out what the hypothesis is, how to design this test, but we don't necessarily have to answer this major question. We can test our way to it. And I imagine there's been a lot of talk about A/B testing in your podcast, right? It's a great way to test ideas, and we can talk about maybe how to do that. But I think experimentation in general can take the pressure off teams to say, this is the right answer. This is the one idea that we're going to commit for the next 3 years in our strategy, and simply say, this is what we believe right now. We'll test it along the way, and if something changes, we can change our mind. But we don't have to make this never-ending commitment for the next few years.
Well, but I also think what you added on there, add on to that is to think about what a realistic, plan would be like that. So, for example, I go through and I make the decision I'm going to do some split testing, and how long does the process, take, if it actually meant the transformation. So, like, for example, I did some testing. It's on a smaller scale. I have a certain amount of sample. I have a certain amount of confidence, and then where do I go from there?
Yeah. So once you got that small testing, I would scale that up. So I would either do a bigger test, or I would try to roll that out, and again, have some data to track the result, not just at the short term, but the long term. Right. So sometimes you see
and that's what I mean.
That does well. Yeah.
Well, that's what I mean. Is like, so think about this. Is that do I go through 2 rounds of bigger sampling? So, I take it from, here, which was a small sample. Let's just get to straight numbers. Okay. So when I dealt with data sets, dealing and measuring the customer experience, we deal with confidence levels all the time because people would want to shoot down results, if it wasn't of a certain, level of confidence. Right. And especially the people who are executives who went through MBA schools. Oh, well, that's not a 3% confidence level, and they just shoot the whole thing out. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. Let's understand about how variability in confidence levels actually works, right? So, I mean, if this number is off, it's only off by this much, right? So put it in perspective. But if we're dealing at smaller scale, what we used to tell clients is that, look, when you start getting above 30 samples, you'll start seeing consistency in your data. And if I'm starting to see consistency in my data, and maybe I don't, I can't realistically do a sample of, 500 because I'm a smaller organization, right? When can I potentially take that sample of 30 and doing a split test and maybe take it to a larger sample, before I do a full rollout? Because that's like, it's almost like putting yourself, in the pool. I do a toe, I do a foot, I do an ankle, and I go knee up, and then, woo, how long does it realistically take for somebody to go through that process?
I would say it's a bit tricky, because it will depend on the traffic. I would say, generally speaking, an experiment will probably be at least in the number of weeks. So at least in the number of couple of weeks to be able to see a full cycle. That is a full week. You might have some seasonality between weekdays versus weekends. So to go through the process you just mentioned, where you might have a couple tests that get bigger and bigger before a rollout, I think realistically you're probably looking at least a few weeks, maybe a month or so to fully do that. And it may not sound like a lot, but of course, some companies are thinking, why can't we do this weekend, right? Why can't we run one test and then next Monday we'll roll it out to everyone? But that's I think where you run into issues. There was a story about Uber, and they discovered that a big portion of their paid advertising was not actually driving conversions, and they just turned it off altogether. And the conversions dropped, of course, but not as much as they expected. So even a company like Uber that has all these resources, they are struggling with the attribution as to what role does something like paid ads play. So if you're a small company, you want to be more careful. You want to be a little bit more conservative, because you may run into things that may be harmful. I had a client that they came up with the idea of a discount for their service, and it was only about 10% of what the total product price. But they didn't test it. They just ran it, and they just actually deployed it to everyone. It was a full rollout, and it worked. The discount got more customers during 1 month, let's say January. But then what they realized is that their numbers in February got affected because they really kind of capture a lot of the potential February conversions in the January. So it was really more harmful in the long run than the short run. So things like this can happen. So you do want to be more careful and having what I see companies maybe don't get right as much in testing. It's not so much the lack of weighting or doing it enough, is that they don't design the test properly, right? They don't have the right sample sizes, the right conditions for what success means. So they run it, their tool testing is a success, and they just say, okay, our A/B testing tool said it's valid, it's confident, let's roll it out. But I do think there's a little bit more thinking that needs to go before you can do that kind of rollout.
Well, that's very helpful, but at least it gives people an understanding that it is a process, right? And yes. And the fact is you must do it. I mean, we have to be able to try different things in order to measure their effect. Because, I mean, you tell me. I mean, what could a 1% change mean in regards to conversion?
Well, there's that math where if you were to get better by 1% every day, in about 70 days, you'd be twice as good. Now, maybe for companies, they might not get 1% better every day, but if you do that, let's say every couple of weeks, then by the end of the year, you could be doubling conversions, and that could really double revenue and double profit and so on.
It's huge. It has some huge potential. Yeah. Data can definitely, help you in a number of ways, no pun intended, that you could have never imagined. And relying on your gut is not the way to go. It just isn't. You have to always test yourself, because what you knew prior to March 2020 isn't the same.
Exactly. Yeah.
Ruben, I had fun with you today. How can the B2B DM gang get in touch with you?
Well, they can check out my website. That is rubenugarte.com. You'll find links to the book, The Data Mirage. I think there's a lot of different ideas there. If you're an individual, an entrepreneur, a coach, consultant, I think there's a few things that will help you better understand how to deal with your clients. And if you're a small company, then you'll understand what's maybe the right approach for your stage, which is, I think, vastly different from what a Fortune 500 company is doing. So I would say all those things can be found at the website, and anything else, blogs, free content, it's all there.
Ruben Ugarte, thank you for sharing your knowledge and wisdom, and we wish you the very best.
Thanks, Jim. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us. Go now to join the B2B DM gang in the B2B Marketer LinkedIn group, where you can connect with other B2B DM disruptors and get access to our B2B DM cheat sheets, checklist, and guides. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, Please help by going to iTunes to rate, review, and subscribe. And share the show on all of your digital platforms. Be sure to tune in next week for our next episode. And always remember, you can automate your lead capture, but you must lure your lead.